All right, so today's lesson really, guys, is going to be focusing on immigration to the United States through the 1850s. And what was it that drew people to come to this continent, to where the United States would become a country to begin with? Now, when we are talking about immigration, all right, oftentimes we think of the beautiful inscription that we see on our Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be breathed free. Now, while the Statue of Liberty was not, in fact, given to the United States until the late 1890s, her symbolism, her presence, all right, in New York Harbor as a quote-unquote beacon of light and hope to immigrants coming from Europe has become a well-known image in American history. But what we have to understand when speaking about immigration, particularly through the 1850s, is there was more to it than just the idea of gold, glory, and finding wealth, bounty, and riches for one's family. In fact, what we have to look at and consider are what are known as push-pull factors. Now, push meaning exactly like it sounds like, what made people leave or get pushed out of their original homes, and what was it that drew or pulled them into what would be the United States over time? Well, when we talk about different immigrant groups, their stories are never going to be the same. Depending on what country they came from, what hemisphere, all right, these push-pull factors change with every single person's story. Now, if we actually go back all the way into the 1600s, all right, one of the very earliest groups to come here to the Americas to quote-unquote settle this land were the English. Particularly in this early 1600s, the Pilgrims. This would have been one of the earlier European groups to come to the Americas to start settling land. Now, we do know stories of the Spanish and the conquistadors in South and Central America and the Caribbean, and we do know stories of Norwegians coming into the northern parts of the continent. But for the sake of our story, we're going to start here. Now, once the English started to come into Americas, we start seeing them colonize. For the Pilgrims, their push factor was actually their religion. These guys were called Puritans and were very much not welcomed by a lot of other English groups. And so they left England in order to be able to worship and practice their religion freely the way they chose. At the same time, other push factors included poor harvests, hunger, and just a desire to earn a better living. Now, over time, as these guys become established and we see other European groups coming into the Americas, including, of course, the French, we see the Dutch also coming and settling. What we see happen over time is the creation of also a slave trade. Now, Africans to the Americas were unwilling immigrants. Their push-pull factors very different from, of course, what we saw with the Europeans, where this was an immigration not done by choice. The image you see would have been typical of a slave ship of the time, where people were literally stacked in very, very tight bunks, chained into place underneath in steerage like they were animals or cargo. And so their experience of coming to this country far different than what we saw with other European immigrants of the time period. It was not uncommon for many people to die during this passage between Africa and the United States, but understand that this was part of what would become known as the slave triangle or the trade triangle between Africa, the Americas, and Europe. As they discovered that certain crops could be grown in America that were highly desired in Europe, we see this situation occurring where the Europeans would travel to Africa to trade guns, ammo, other goods with tribes, at which point we see people being purchased for those goods, being thrown into ships to cross the Atlantic, where they would be settled in our southern colonies and in the Caribbean islands to produce crops that would then in turn be shipped to the Europeans, and it would continue in this way. The Irish story is also different. Their push-pull factors, more similar to what we see with the Europeans, but different in with the English Europeans, but different in its own way. In the case of the Irish, they were very much motivated to leave Europe during the 1840s because of what was known as the Great Potato Famine. All right. Now, during this time, a lot of people in Ireland were actually starving and dying of starvation and disease because of a lack of a food source. What had happened is their crop, the predominant one being potatoes, was impacted by something known as a potato blight, which wiped out plants across their nation. At the time, their country was controlled, and still is, by the English. English landowners were not super sympathetic to their problems. And so we see the Irish essentially being pushed out of their country in a way to try to survive. Now, when it came to pull factors, once again, it was this idea that once they arrived in the United States, they had opportunities for jobs, land ownership, a place to raise a family, food, resources. And so you see this mass immigration of Irish during this period of time from the 1840s to the 1850s. We also see a mass immigration of our German immigrants. Again, once we see a situation in which we have people who are seeking asylum in the United States, so they have the ability to practice their religions much more freely. We see groups of people from Germany coming, seeking, again, the same things that we saw with the Irish, where they're looking to expand, make a living, do better for themselves and their families as they push forward. And then the last group we'll talk about in this video are, in fact, the Chinese. Now, during this time in their history, the Chinese were actually facing their own revolution in their country, which led to a lot of poverty and a lot of starvation. So the Chinese actually came to America in what they call waves, or groupings of people. And so we see these people coming to the United States and the US territories from China, many seeking wealth that they could send home to their families. Now, for the Chinese, that big pull factor is what brings them over in these huge groups. And that included jobs on the Transcontinental Railroad as well as the gold rush. Their push factor, of course, being that revolution piece. Now, so you guys can get this kind of grip, for a lot of these immigrants, not all of them had actually had the intention to stay. The Chinese were actually a group that had hoped to make their wealth, send it home, and then head home once things settled down. But as unrest in their nation grew harder and bigger and stronger, many Chinese instead chose to stay in the United States and pulled their families to move in with them. So, guys, America is this really beautiful, unique nation in that we are not homogenous. We are not all one people, okay? We are many peoples. And I know when I was a kid growing up, they often referred to this as the great melting pot. But in actuality, America is like the best soup or stew you've ever had, or even a salad if you're digging salads, where every ingredient plays a role in the flavor of what is the whole recipe, all right? So imagine your most favorite soup and think about what goes into that. And then imagine if you took out one or two of those ingredients. How would the flavor have changed in that soup? The same applies to America. When we look at the United States and we see so many different people who have come here and the reasons for that, and then we look at what they have contributed to our nation, our culture, and our society, you realize that the United States is unique in that sense that we have a beautiful nation with so many different people who not only embrace being Americans, but also still have the freedom to embrace who they are as a culture and society. The other important factor to consider is how much immigrants have contributed to America. On the east side of our nation, the large influx of Irish immigrants actually led to them being the heavy contributor to the building of the Erie Canal and other canal systems. In the West, the Chinese were our heavy immigrant contributor to the building of our railroad systems. So even though they were from other nations, they actually helped to interconnect both East and West in our country, which would then become, of course, their country.